don't know a single person or single sommelier that doesn't like champagne. I mean, I met one once, but they're so weird. Champagne unites everyone. It's easy drinking, goes with everything. It's highbrow, it's lowbrow. There's so many different styles, vintage, non-vintage. It's incredible and very complex. Hey, how's it going? You guys are good? Well, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you so much for being here. I'm so passionate about this topic that we're going to talk about, which is champagne. So you got to bear with me, though. I'm like the littlest bit nervous, and no matter how many times I teach classes, no matter that I'm a master sommelier and I own restaurants and I do this for a living, there's always that moment where I'm like picturing you all naked. You know that, right? I'm just letting you know. So, you know, you all look good. It's all good. Let's cheers and drink some champagne for starters. Cheers. I want to tell you a little bit about this and what we're going to do. Today we're going to have 3 champagnes, and the champagnes are totally different, and they're all about these personal stories that I either have connections with the wineries or I love drinking them. And I really want the bottles to tell the story because I think that's the most important thing. And I feel like even though we're calling this a master experience, this is like a conversation between us about wine. So how many people are in the sommelier world? There are sommeliers, they work in restaurants, they're servers, any kind of wine. Okay, great. Has anybody visited Champagne? All right, great. So I think based on the amount of people we have in the audience that are sommeliers versus, you know, just passionate wine enthusiasts, we're gonna just start at the beginning, and I hope you entertain me here. I wanna say why I love champagne. So I worked Harvest in 2010, and it was the most unbelievable experience of my life. I'm gonna tell you all about the stories and the characters, and there were so many of them. But the reason I wanted to work in Champagne above all other places for my first Harvest, right before I opened my business, was because it is the most difficult wine in the world to make, period. It is a study of contrasts. You get white wine from red grapes. It is like, you know, the most celebratory, most luxurious beverage in the world, but there's been so much war fought in those very soils where the grapes grow. And you have to make wine twice. So that's incredible. And when we think about all these terms that I'm going to teach you about, non-vintage, vintage, blanc to blanc, blanc to noir, teaching you about the Grand Crus and the main regions, all of these things in this bottle, which is really freaking cool. All right, so at the beginning, after all, champagne is a wine. We forget about that sometimes. And actually, one of the reasons I'm drinking champagne out of a wine glass like this and not a champagne flute is because it is just like any other wine. It has aroma, it has flavor. There are many producers and many styles of it. So we have to remember that. Okay, so what happens? You go into the Champagne region. We'll talk about all the different nuances of that in a minute. And you pick your grapes. And in the case of Champagne, you have to pick really early in the morning. And you generally pick these grapes when they're slightly underripe. Okay, so we'll go in our vineyards, and when I worked Harvest, you kind of get up at like 6 in the morning, you go to this, I lived in this winery where I'm gonna show you the Rosé from, and you wake up in the morning, you go downstairs for breakfast, get a little coffee, some, you know, of course, champagne at breakfast, because why wouldn't you feed the harvesters champagne at 6 in the morning? And you get your little shears, and you get in teams of 2, and you get into the vineyards, and it's just like this beautiful place. It's, you know, green rolling hills. It's not super steep. It doesn't feel like when you're in the Mosel and you're hanging on the side of a river, but you get dropped off in these vineyards and you're paired off and you're literally across the grapevine. You know, I heard it through the grapevine, that whole gossip thing. So you're across the grapevine from another picker and you're kind of bent down like this the whole time. Really good for your squats. I was so excited. I was in the best shape of my life. And so you're bent down and you're cutting, looking in the foliage of the grapes for these beautiful clusters of perfect grapes. And you cut them off the vine and you put them in these little baskets. The little baskets are called FYBs. They're not really called that. It's called panier, but FYB would be a freaking yellow basket because these baskets are so small and you're crouched in half getting these grapes that every 5 minutes you have to get up and say, panier, panier. There's a guy running down the vineyard rows taking your little panier and dumping it into a slightly larger area. The reason he's doing this is because these are Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, in some cases Chardonnay grapes, and you don't want the pressure from the top of the grapes to squish, right, the grapes on the bottom. So it's a very, very delicate process. So we're picking these grapes. Okay, these grapes are going to go back to the press house, to the winery, and then they're going to be fermented. So the process for fermentation says we get some yeast. Sometimes it's natural, like our winery had some natural yeast. And sometimes you inoculate, you build a little yeast structure, put some grape juice in, and then you put that yeast into your wine. The yeast start eating away at the grape sugar, and you get alcohol. You also get carbon dioxide. That's why it's very important, but we'll fast forward and talk about that in a minute. So we have our base wine in Champagne. So all the carbon dioxide the first time is released into the air. Let's call it a stainless steel tank. Some people produce and ferment wine in barrel, like Krug. Anyway, we have this base wine. We can also call it a vin clair. And that's why I said you're going to make wine once. Generally, that base wine is maybe 10% alcohol. It's very acidic because Champagne was a very cold place, and grapes are picked generally in August to early September, underripe. The whole idea is this acidity, lip smacking. But if you drink vin clair, if you've ever tasted just like those base wines, they're pretty harsh, right? So what happens next? We take this vin clair that's been either sitting in tank or in barrel, like right around March, and now we have to do what we call the method champenoise. So we take this base wine and we add it to a bottle, just like this. Put this wine in the bottle, and we add a little bit of a starter, if you will. Some wine, some sugar, and some yeast. So you put that magic starter inside the bottle, and you close the top of the bottle with a crown cap. The crown cap has what we call a little bidule. It's kind of like a gathering place. And what happens? Now we rest the wine on its side. So, as you can imagine, sugar plus yeast equals alcohol and carbon dioxide. And what happens is that now we have an environment where the yeast are going to eat the sugar and they're going to form that carbon dioxide, but it's inside the bottle. So the carbon dioxide is not allowed to be released. In this case, it's called the Champagne method. It's the only method allowed, right? So the Champagne method, so yeast eats sugar. They only put a certain amount in. Now yeast has no more food. What's it going to do? It dies, right? So I hate to say dead yeast. Oh, yeah, sir, there's some dead yeast in your wine, right? We don't say that. So we say lees, or we say spent yeast. Sounds so much better. So these spent yeast are now in the bottle, right? And so when we talk about Champagne, everything that we remember, everything we teach has to be like, but why does it matter to me as a consumer? Why should I care? So now this yeast is breaking down. It's sitting on its side like this. Imagine bread, sticky dough yeast. You can kind of hold it up to a light, and you can see this yeast on the side. The idea is that this bottle of wine, on average, will sit with this yeast for like 15 months, okay, for non-vintage, 36 months for vintage. But it's going to break down this yeast, and it's going to be flavorful. And the flavors we're going to get are toast and brioche and biscuits and all the amazing things I'm making you crave at brunch. Right? So why does Champagne go so well with eggs? This is my tangent, because it's like brioche and buttered biscuits. I mean, let's go, right? So now the yeast are breaking down, and it's called autolysis, the gradual breakdown of yeast. And these yeast are incorporating their yeasty quality. That's an official term, by the way. Just kidding. And the wine is becoming one with the yeast. So this yeast now is stuck, if you will, in this bottle. And it used to be that the first styles of sparkling wine were made by accident, right? It was so cold in Champagne. It's the northernmost, one of the northernmost climates where fine wine is grown, 48th, 49th parallel. So these wines, people didn't know. They were making still wine in the early 17th century. They were just trying to make Pinot Noir to compete with Burgundy, and they would just put their wines in a barrel, add some yeast, and wait for the bubbles to stop. Imagine, like, the idea of fermentation wasn't quite understood exactly how it happens, but if you saw bubbles, you knew it was active. If you didn't see bubbles, then all of a sudden it must be done, right? But in a cold climate, yeast can't survive. So it's cold, it's like November, December, early 17th century. The yeast go dormant. They're not actually finished with their job. They go dormant, and the winemaker puts it in a bottle, and it's wood fire bottles, so they're not very strong, and he sticks it in his cellar and he waits. Okay, all of a sudden spring happens, and the cellars start warming up, and the bottles start exploding. Well, what's going on here? Well, the yeast have not finished their job of fermenting all of the sugar into alcohol. So maybe those method ancestral, those ancient styles of sparkling wine, of course, it was one fermentation, that first one, right? But in the case when we finally discover, okay, this is happening by accident, we're losing tens of thousands of bottles, it's very dangerous, I'm going into this cellar with like armor just because things are exploding everywhere. And by the way, it still happens. They still have some one-off bottles that just explode. So what we needed to do is understand why that was happening, right? And then control the exact amount of sugar we put with the yeast, and that would lead to a certain amount of pressure. So the first sparkling wines were by accident, but as a result, we were able to start intentionally making sparkling wine. Does that make sense? Right? It does make sense. I'm taking a sip. I have this rule. It's like kind of like Pee Wee Herman, only better. Anytime I say the word champagne, you should take a sip of wine. I might not be able to finish the lecture. No, I'm just kidding. I talk a lot. Okay, so that's the process. So now we have this spent yeast in the bottle. And in the early 18th century, we would just be drinking sediment-laden sparkling wine, which is to say, you know, maybe we thought about those coupes, you know, where we drink like those coupes for champagne modeled after Marie Antoinette's breast. Okay, because we're just chugging this glass of champagne because the yeast is still there. We don't want this like weird sediment in our glass, right? So finally, you probably have heard some of these stories. Madame Veuve Clicquot, she's a widow. She's charged with taking her family winery out of bankruptcy. And she's up late at night, as we would imagine. It's pretty stressful being a widow, running a family winery, you know, all of these things. And I would imagine, I mean, I'm sure this is a little bit of like Disney-fied storytelling, but she's up late at night one night and says, like, the sediment in my bottle of champagne is just not enjoyable. And I'm looking at my table, my dining room table, and I'm thinking, what if I took this bottle, let me make sure it's empty so I don't spill it on myself. What if I took this bottle that was on its side that has this spent yeast cells, and what if I somehow could get the yeast to the neck of the bottle without disrupting it? So she says, okay, let's cut my dining room table in half. Let's make it kind of like an inverted A shape. Maybe I'll cut some holes in it, 60 holes, and I'll just stick these bottles in the hole. And then if I take these bottles that are on their side and I can somehow get the bottle from the side to the point, to Sir Point, I'm essentially like, yeah, see? That's okay, I'll drink it. So I'm essentially going to get to nudge, I call it nudge the sludge. So we're just like pushing this yeast to the neck of the bottle. And then, if I'm really careful, I can either freeze the neck of the bottle, I can pop off that soda pop top, expel the yeast, quickly get my bottle right side up, and I have sparkling wine, but I don't have sediment. So this rumillage, this style of riddling, as we call it, I want to say we can credit Veuve Clicquot for this idea of gently turning the bottle a quarter turn until we get to a Sir Point. Okay, so that's really important. So now what happens? I was really curious. I was like, why are champagne bottles the only bottles that have these large foils? Did you ever think about that? I think about all these dorky things, right? So I'm in the supermarket and I'm like, okay, well, what if I cut little slices in all the champagne necks and I could kind of look and see which one is the most full and I could take that one? Does that make sense, right? Because that's a joke. If I did that, I'd probably be like thrown out of every supermarket in New York City. But what I'm really trying to express and make you remember is this idea that not every bottle of wine is equal. Maybe now we can imagine technology can help us, but at that time, okay, we're expelling yeast. It's not an exact thing. Some people still do this disgorgement process by hand. Like when I worked in Champagne, I went to this winery for lunch, Tarlant, and they were like, you should do the disgorgement. Here's a bottle. And they had this like little birdhouse, right? And so they were like, take this hook and like point the bottle at the birdhouse and then like just slowly like take the soda pop top off. And at the same time you do that, quickly turn your arm. So the guy showed me. He was like, boop. And all of a sudden, okay, this much was missing. Said again, boop. This much is missing. I was like, all right, I got this. I'm gonna do this for lunch for all the vineyard workers, So I pop it off, like half the bottle's gone. Because like, I don't know that move. Like that move is not new to me. I can't dance either. Very bad with my moves. So the point is the disgorgement process by hand, it's a little bit trickier. But we can also now use machines and technology to our advantage, and we can make it so that each bottle, the neck is frozen, you expel the yeast, now you have the perfect amount, right? So what happens next? Next, we need to fill up the little bit of lost wine that we've expelled, and we also might want to consider getting involved in making this wine more enjoyable. So I'm sure you guys have made margaritas at home, right? If you have a margarita, it's a balance of tequila, alcohol. It's triple sec or Cointreau or however fancy you are, and it is lime juice. So you can imagine tequila and lime juice is a different beverage, and it's, alcohol and acidity. So champagne could be like that too. It has wine, it's an alcoholic beverage, it's got racing acidity, right? That's why sommeliers love champagne. It makes my mouth salivate, makes my stomach juices get going, crave salt, French fries, champagne, fried chicken, caviar, all of that. And the point is, it needs to be balanced. The natural brut or extra brut sauvage champagne, like if I just took that bottle I disgorged and just said, here you go, I'm gonna fill this wine up a little bit more, but this time it's gonna have 0 sugar, it's gonna be very austere. It's gonna taste delicious, but might not be for everyone. It's like having tequila and lime juice. It's no triple sec to bind it. So what happens in most sparkling wine or most champagne is that we'll take a certain amount of sugar and dissolve it into a liter of wine, a reserve wine, if you will, and we'll take that dosage, as we call it, and dose the bottles. So there are a certain amount of grams per liter of sugar, grams dissolved in a liter of wine, so we call it grams per liter, that make different styles of sparkling champagne and such. So for example, if we see something like 0 dosage, that means that instead of putting a little bit of sugar dissolved in wine and dosing the wine, we just put nothing. So we can expect very, very acidic, tart things. If we dissolve, let's say, between 0 and 6 grams of sugar in a bottle of wine, we can make something like an extra brut. If we do 0 or 6 to 12, we can make something like a brut. So there are different levels of sweetness, and they go from 0 all the way to 50 grams. So this is a desired taste profile, right? Most non-vintage champagnes that we see, if we're talking about Louis Roederer and their Brut Premier, or Ruinart and their Blanc de Blanc, they're non-vintage, which we'll get to in a minute. They're gonna be anywhere from that 0 to 12 mark. And so you'll start to understand, oh, I really like Veuve Clicquot. I think it's that style that I enjoy. So you might wanna ask yourself, where on the Brut level, what a range of sugar do they add? And then find others that are similar, right? So, for example, you see the word demi-sec, and I say, hey, you want to come over for some champagne? We're going to serve some oysters. You bring demi-sec. You're probably going to be like, Laura, that's ridiculous. Like, that's way too sweet. So, depending on what you like, I feel like I'm half comedian, by the way, and half like wine teacher. So, comedians drink water in the middle of talking. So, Plus, I always thought about like the stool, like Jerry Seinfeld. Like, maybe I'll tell some jokes. You guys will laugh. Anyway, so if I said, yeah, let's drink some demi-sec champagne and oysters, you would say that's ridiculous because it's way too sweet. But why is everybody serving champagne proper, brut champagne with wedding cake? That was my one no-no. I was like, I love champagne. We're having a champagne reception at our wedding, and it really was. It was like insane. They were like, we went through all 5 cases of champagne you brought. I'm like, it's only like a half an hour through my wedding. A lot of wine people there. But they were like, toast with champagne. I'm like, no, we're going to toast with Armagnac instead. So yeah, there was a very boozy wedding. Anyway, so we get the process of making champagne, right? This is the only method champenois, that's allowed to make champagne. So that's why I find it so fascinating. Individual bottles of wine are becoming bubbly. That is crazy. So if you contrast that with other styles, you can inject CO2 into wine. That's really bad. That's when people say, like, you have that friend that has a wedding and like, you know, they don't know anything about wine. Then the waitress is like, champagne? And you're like, no, I know what that is. That is sparkling wine injected with CO2. I won't have any. Give me a gin and tonic. But you know the point. So that's one method. And then another method, which is very respected, is like a style where you would make that secondary fermentation that I spoke about inside a tank. And then you would bottle that wine under pressure, right? So you can call it like a style that's like more of a bulk style. So why would you want to use that? Perhaps you don't want the yeasty quality. You don't want the autolysis or the gradual breakdown of yeast in your bottle. So when my friends say, well, what champagne should I use for Bellinis? I'm like, no. We're going to get you a style of wine that's made in the bulk method. That's going to give you that freshness, but maybe not the yeasty, toasty brioche thing. So this is why it's important. The longer a wine sits with the lees, the yeast, the more toasty, brioche, intense, buttered, biscuity it is. So why the heck would I ever care to memorize numbers? Like, I'm telling you, and as long as I've had my restaurants, that's 8 years, and before that I worked for a company for 10, no one's ever said, can you please tell me the exact amount of years that this wine has sat with the lees? I mean, sommeliers might say, oh, do you know how much time it's spent in the lees? And that's great. But what they do say, and what they often say, is which one is more biscuity? I'm in the mood for like a champagne that drinks like as big, as rich, as buttery as possible. So here's where it comes in, why numbers are important. You say, okay, well, sir, madam, whatever, this bottle of brut, non-vintage, spent a minimum of 15 months aging sur lie, and this vintage champagne spent a minimum of 36 months aging sur lie. So you guys, I'm not gonna ask you because I don't wanna put you on the spot, but tell me which one is more biscuity. Well, based on what I told you, of course it's the vintage champagne. So I'm looking for the fresh, crudo champagne, the one that I'm serving with like grapefruit and endive. So we're thinking bitter, sour, refreshing, crudo. We do not want buttered toast, right? But I'm getting to lobster and I have like a brown butter sauce and I want the buttered toast. So again, one of the reasons I'm so passionate about champagne is that it really does go from soup to nuts. It is a sparkling wine, but it is a wine first and foremost. And there are so many other things that go into it. You feel it? All right, so what do we think about this? So this is Pierre Peters. It's called Cuvée de Reserve, and it's Blanc de Blanc. So a Blanc de Blanc, you know, we're just gonna read labels. We're gonna use labels as part of our conversation. So Blanc means white. Blanc de Blanc, white from white. Okay, that's cool. All right, so next time I see Blanc de Blanc, I should ask myself, well, what kind of white grapes are growing in Champagne? All right, so technically, I'm gonna tell you the rules and I'm gonna tell you after the break the rule. Because that's how like wine people teach. If I tell you everything at once, you're gonna be like, you just blew my mind, Laura. So sometimes I withhold information. Okay, there are only 3 grapes in Champagne. There's only one white grape in Champagne, Chardonnay. So for the most part, when I read a wine list and I see Blanc de Blanc, I can assume this is 100% Chardonnay. So what do we know about Chardonnay? It's a white grape. It grows so well in Burgundy. It's not too far from Champagne. It is a very noble grape. It is a grape that expresses terroir, if we can talk about that word. And that means that if it grows on chalk, it tastes chalky. And if it grows on coccolithophores, these like decomposed seashells, it's gonna taste like decomposed seashells, obviously, right? Seawater, I'm just kidding. You should hear the terms that we describe wine in. It's like, it blows my mind. So I try to like actually not use them that much, but once in a while I wanna be like, yeah, it tastes like coccolithophores or microcrust or whatever. You know, that's sea urchin. Anyway, I digress. Champagne, Chardonnay, one of the most Chardonnay is the best expressor of soil, of environment, because it's a neutral grape. We don't think of it as neutral. We think of apple, pear, vanilla, butter, but really, Chardonnay is as neutral as you get for white wines, the grape. So what it does bring is acidity and ability to adapt. And it loves limestone and chalk, and it grows really well there. So this wine is Blanc de Blanc, so there's no Pinot Noir, and there's no Meunier. Those are the other two noble grapes that grow in Champagne. So I say there are 3 Champagne grapes. You say 2 are red, 1 are white. The reds are Pinot Noir, Meunier, and Chardonnay. Chardonnay is gonna give acidity. It's gonna make the linear styles, the ones that are like, just like so focused, so fresh, so age-worthy, by the way, very age-worthy, and really adaptable. Pinot Noir, that's one of our red grapes. And we know Pinot Noir is so fickle and so hard to grow. I had a friend that said, if you cry in a vineyard of Pinot Noir, it's gonna rot. It's kind of a joke, but what it means is you have this thin skin and it's incredibly hard to keep healthy without it getting sunburnt, without it getting mold, without it splitting, thin skin, think about that. But Pinot Noir is incredibly aromatic. When we smell Pinot Noir, we think about red fruit, cherries, strawberries, raspberries. We think about flowers, we think about mushrooms. Again, a really good expressor of terroir, as we know from the great vineyards of Burgundy. So these two are noble grapes. Maybe Pinot Noir is gonna be the one that we have structure. So that's like if we want that little bit of grip, we want to like, it's not tannic, but if we want a little bit more mouthfeel or texture, perhaps some Pinot Noir, and especially when we want to put our nose in a glass and be like, oh, wow, that's so aromatic. Often what I do is when I have a Pinot Noir-based wine, I put it in a Burgundy bowl, especially if it's a champagne that I think is like really expensive or should show the characteristics more. So we're gonna taste one right now, or pretty soon we're gonna bring out 100% Pinot Noir wine. And this is from another region in Champagne. I'll tell you about it. But this Blanc de Blanc that you were greeted with is from one of my favorite producers. His best quote, I was with him, and he was in an audience. We were doing this conference in New Orleans, and he said to everybody, because he had a magnum of Pierre Peter Chetillon, his single vineyard, and he said, you know what? A magnum of champagne is the perfect amount of wine for 2 people. And I was like, yeah, you're right. And he's like, when one person isn't drinking. It's like, yeah, that's so true. That is so true. I'm like, wow, man, that's good. Okay, so his wine, it's expressing the soil. He's in this region called Le Maniec-sur-Auger. And this wine is a cuvée de réserve. And it's labeled as Grand Cru. So we should talk about that for a bit. So we talked about the Champagne method. Now we have to talk about the Champagne region. There are 5 major regions in Champagne. In the north, we have the mountains. They're called the Montagne de Reims. So the mountains, but it's not really mountains, these little forests by the city of Reims. And the Montagne de Reims is a region. And then the next region, if we're going south, following the Marne River, is a region called the Vallée de la Marne. And the main city there would be Epernay. So you have Reims and Epernay. That's where I worked. I worked in the Vallée de la Marne, and it follows the Marne River. And then you get to the southern region of the 3 main ones, and it's called the Côte de Blanc. So mountain by Reims, valley following the Marne River, hill of white, Côte de Blanc. So if somebody says how many regions are in Champagne, the answer is really 5. But the main regions are those three. Then we have this kind of break in vineyards for Champagne, and we get to this area called the Côte de Bar, which is also known as the Aube. I'm so passionate about this region. I mean, some of these, I'm passionate about everything. Like strawberry shortcake bicycles, by the way. My favorite thing besides Champagne is my grandpa gave me like a strawberry shortcake bicycle when I was like 5, and I sent Jason a photo of myself. I was like, I'm this happy to teach this Champagne class as I was then. But anyway, Côte de Bar, the Aube region, it's another incredible region, and maybe it was less known than the main regions because of this kind of 1900s, if you will, like little riot slash discrepancy of the Champagne boundaries, which I'll tell you about. And then there's a region called the Côte de Sézanne. So right now we're gonna get ready to pour 100% Pinot Noir from the Aube. First you had Côte de Blanc, then you're gonna have the Aube. And as I'm talking, just thinking about this wine, see how do you think it's different? I got that fresh Chardonnay-based one, and this one is from a grower producer. He actually happens to be one of the largest grower champagnes. Remind me, I have to tell you about grower champagne versus Grand Marques. But then last but not least, we have the grape Meunier. And Meunier is a red grape. Some people call it Pinot Meunier, but Meunier. And this grape is really important in the Champagne blend because it's frost resistant. And one of the reasons that's important is because remember, Pinot Noir is so delicate, and maybe not anymore, but there was a period of time where in Champagne, 3 or 4 times a decade, you would get a vintage Champagne. And all the other time, you were struggling to pick grapes. It would rain, you had frost, it was cold, you couldn't ripen things. So Champagne became what it is because of its environment, right? And so Meunier, growing near the Marne River mostly, I mean, it grows other places, but on the Vallée de la Marne, you've got these clay soils and they retain water. I remember going to work, that's mainly where I worked, and like having my boots like filled with mud and walking in the morning to pick grapes, and I'd have 3 layers on, and it was really wet. I mean, in 2010 when I worked Harvest, they had, I think, 2 months worth of rain in the period of 3 days. It was really, really funny. I, of course, was like studying like what the temperature is going to be like. So you wear a tank top underneath, and then you wear a sweater on top, and then you have, you know, maybe like an underlying pant, and then you have like a waterproof pant because basically you're on your knees picking grapes. So there were these 2 British girls that were on Gap, and they were so funny. They were my favorite people. And they didn't have any idea what you wear to harvest grapes. So they like just brought their spandex. And of course they're like the whole time like soaking wet, like freezing cold. And I'm like, mama hen. I'm like, okay guys, like the 3rd day in when they're like, we're so cold, our hands are freezing, we can't pick grapes. I was like, okay, I've got this covered. Like, come to my room. I'm giving you both like waterproof pants because we cannot hear you guys complain about this anymore. It was so funny. The characters in A Harvest are crazy. Like I was telling these guys when we were getting ready to film, my favorite memory of Champagne, I speak a little bit of French, enough to get by, and especially then I was like really knew I was gonna go work Harvest and live there for a month or 2. So I like really brushed up on my French, but Champagne is a little bit like, there's like these small villages, you know, and some people, like they do speak English, of course, but then there are people that like, you know, that they're in this village, that's what they've done their whole life. So this one guy he was probably 19, didn't speak any English. And so he's my partner most days, and we're, you know, gossiping through the grapevine. And the funniest part was like, he's like, we were playing music, we were just like talking, doing all these things. And he's like, you know, perfect, like, French for English. He was like, do you have any David Guetta? And I'm like, David Guetta? Like music? He's like, yeah. I mean, some of you might know what that is. I was like, yeah, I can like pull it up on my iPhone. And he's like basically making me play this David Guetta music, which is like, I don't know, I can't sing, but like all the crazy things that you did tonight. You know that? These will be the best memories. So it was really funny. But anyway, the point is, yes, I have a lot of memories of Champagne. And yeah, that music and picking grapes connects you. And so that was in the Vallée de la Marne. So we mostly grew Meunier, and Meunier as a grape is a fruity style. So it gives you kind of like the mid palate. You have the austere, you have the aromatics, and then you have the fruit in the middle. As far as these 3 grapes grow and go, The majority are generally, when it doesn't say else on the label, 33, 33, 33, meaning like it's a blend of Pinot Noir, Meunier, and Chardonnay. We don't have any of those wines today, but you've had them. I mean, if you've had the Grand Marque champagnes, you've tried what it looks like as a blend. And the reason that they generally blended champagne, these three grapes, and these three regions, for the most part, the Montagne de Reims is a majority planted to Pinot Noir. The Vallée de la Marne is majority planted to Meunier, and the Côte de Blanc, as the name suggests, is majority planted to Chardonnay. So if you had a bad weather pattern in one of your villages or vineyards, you could make up for it. If a vintage wasn't so good in the Côte de Blanc, but it was really good in the Vallée de la Marne, you know, you could imagine that this became like the winemakers in Champagne are like chefs. No, they're not like chefs. They are chefs because they call them chef du cave. And the chef du cave is going to make a wine from 250 different parcels, in the case of Krug, from 20 different vintages, the same way every single time. By the way, not knowing what the finished product is going to be. So, like, he doesn't know what autolysis is going to do to the wine, but how is it that we get the same wine each time? How is it that you buy a bottle in New York City and it tastes the same as if you buy a bottle in Tokyo? So to me, that's like an incredible gift, not only to be able to take these parcels of these grapes and blend them, but also to predict the future, to be like, okay, and that's what it's going to taste like when it breaks down. I mean, mind blown, right? Okay, so now that we've talked about the major regions, we should talk about the classification, or the échelle de cru, which is this. There are 357 villages in Champagne authorized to use the name Champagne. So the region was delimited, the region was created or outlined in 1908. In 1908, somebody said, we don't want any fraudulent wine. We don't want any wine from the Languedoc, the southern regions in France, to be blended and called Champagne. So the growers got involved. There's 20,000 different growers in Champagne, by the way. They make up like 1/4 of the wine we see in the market. So they are a big amount, but they have a small percentage of Champagne sales. But these growers said, you know what, enough. We have to protect our region. We don't want there to be so many people growing grapes and calling themselves Champagne. So the region was delimited in 1908. And then there was a glut where there was way too much wine and they couldn't sell it. And so they had a backlog of Champagne, and they said, you know what? You know, people like in Reims, those are the Grand Marques, most of them are based there. We are going to kind of make the region smaller. We have too much wine. We're going to make the region smaller. So you guys in the Aube, you're kicked out. So you're no longer part of Champagne. That's so insane. You mean to tell me now, what am I going to call my wine? Like, I was Champagne last year, but now I'm not? Like, there's nothing you can call it. So they rioted, as obviously I would, and they stormed Reims and Epernay, and they took barrels of wine from the Northerners, and they threw them in the Marne River, and they said, we have to be part of Champagne. And so this kind of dispute, if you will, when the area was delimited into the time of the beginning of World War I, was still kind of in the middle. And you can imagine there's a little bit of like fire in the belly of the people of the Aube. Like, they're still probably thinking like, we are just as good as you guys. Like, they have a little bit of that, you know, we're real Champagne. They are real Champagne. So now let's drink some real Champagne. You were supposed to drink when I said the word Champagne. I like, you owe me like 5 sips, guys. How is that different than the first? You know, there's this Champagne for everybody. There is a style that fits every palate, and there is so much flavor in this Pinot Noir-based one. So Marie Cortin is the name of the winery. It's extra brut. You know what extra brut means. Very little sugar was added at Dosage, technically up to 3 grams. This is 0. It's 100% Pinot Noir, so only Pinot Noir grapes. Her property is located in a village within the Aube, and it's 2014 vintage. So all of the grapes came from the 2014 vintage. So to contrast that, this is a non-vintage. But I mean, I'm an optimist, so I don't like to say non-vintage, because non-vintage is kind of like, no, it's multi-vintage, right? That's what Krug does. Because it is. Non-vintage, like, when I first started looking at wine lists when I was in my early 20s, I was like, Champagne, NV, Champagne, NV. And I was like, I don't know, people make wine in Nevada? Well, I guess so. I mean, really, I know somebody thought that in this audience at one point. It's fine. You can admit everything you didn't know about wine and now you know. That's like the best part about wine is that tomorrow I'm gonna learn something I didn't know today. I'm gonna mess something up or I'm gonna forget something. Sometimes when I think about forgetting something, I'm like, just like have a panic attack. Like, what was the vintage of which, the first vintage for Champagne Brunard? And, I'm like, I go crazy if I can't remember it at first. So anyway, don't be embarrassed. But this is a multi-vintage. So by law, many vintages went into it. What he does in Pierre Peters is he takes a reserve wine, like 15 years worth of wines. So they have like a mouthfeel and texture because they've been aging. And he has what you would think about as like a perpetual cuvee, a Solera. So a little bit of this vintage, a little bit of this vintage, and up to 15 years. And then he takes the current vintage and he blends a certain percent to make this wine. Whereas she, Dominique, for the wine named after her grandmother, Marie Cortin, she's only sourcing grapes from the 2014 vintage. Neither one is better or worse, they're just different styles. And so if you knew a little bit about the 2014 vintage, you know what to expect. All of her wines are always single vineyard, which is very rare. Single grape, it's not as rare, but it's still rare. Single parcel, single vintage. So I think it's delicious. I'm gonna pour myself a little more. So sip on that. So we've talked about a couple of these terms. Vintage, non-vintage, we covered. Talked about Blanc de Blanc. Blanc de Noir would be another. Blanc de Noir could be 100% Pinot Noir, of course, because it's a red grape. Blanc de Noir means black, white from black. Or it could be a blend of Meunier and Pinot Noir, or it could be 100% Meunier. So how do you know? You really don't. I think a problem, we do this thing at my restaurants called Champagne Campaign. And I have like these t-shirts I was gonna make. I was like so wanting to wear one, but I weren't ready in time. But Champagne Campaign, we do half off champagne after a certain amount, after 9 o'clock. And the reason is because I think that champagne is often considered like a luxury beverage. It's like special occasion. I mean, but it really shouldn't be. It's something that we should be drinking like literally every day, and I would, and I do. I think that the champagne hangover is a lot better than the normal red wine like sleepy hangover. So we did this amazing dinner years ago at Pebble Beach Food and Wine Festival, where like all these New York City like Michelin star, New York Times rated chefs cooked dinner. And at the time, the national director for Krug Champagne was there, and they had this DJ, and it was like Eric Ripert cooking, of course, and Jean-Georges, and Daniel Hume from 11 Madison Park. It was incredible. And all the wines were served from Louis Roeder, the house that makes Cristal. And they were all from the winery, so they were all brought from the house, from the estate, and they were all out of magnums. So that was pretty cool. And the end of the night, they served 79 champagne with like baby goat cores. They served like the current vintage of Cristal, I think at the time was like, 2000 vintage. And everything was served out of Magnum, so it was very hard to like pour these big banquets out of Magnum. Not as hard as other large formats. But anyway, everyone was happy. Like the end of the night at most of those wine dinners, everybody's like, red teeth, like going home. Everyone was like, what's next? Like, where can I go? Like, let's party. It's just bubbly. It's effervescent. You feel it in your bones, right? So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about bottle size, bottle shapes, bottle sizes, especially as it relates to champagne. And I want to talk to those of you that are studying wine about how you keep all this stuff in your head, right? How do you memorize everything? Because there's a lot. And like I said, I'm always paranoid I'm going to forget something. So we have bottle sizes in champagne. And they go from 2 bottles, Magnum, to 20 bottles, Nebuchadnezzar. So 2 bottles, 4 bottles, 6 bottles, 8 bottles, 12 bottles, 16 bottles, 20 bottles. So those are the sizes, and they go like this. Mary Jane really makes some boys nervous. Mnemonics. It's very important when you're trying to memorize. I still, to this day, I'm like, people are like, do you have any RebOMs for sale at CorkBuzz? Like I'm looking to book a large party, and I'm like, Mary Jane really, 2, 4, 6. Ah, 6-bottle wine. You'd like a 6-bottle. Because it's impossible. These are biblical kings. Like, I can't remember which order they go in unless I think about it like that. So a magnum is 2 bottles. That's the perfect amount for 2 people when 1 person isn't drinking. A Jeroboam is 4 bottles. It's the perfect amount for 2 people when 2 people are drinking. Kidding. I won't keep doing that. But what you do is you go 2, 4, 6, 8. And when you get to 8, you add 4. So then you get 12. And then you add 4 again, then you get 16. And then you add 4 again, and you get 20. I'm telling you this, if you're studying wine, it is so much that you have to think about easy ways to remember things. Let's talk about Grand Marques and growers. So I mentioned them a little bit. The Grand Marques are big houses. And legally, these guys can't own more than 15% of the vineyards. So they're not allowed to own that much. And what they do, the Grand Marques, and they have a very special role, is market, make, and sell great champagne. So we can think about those guys, right? Renard, Krug, Moet Chandon, Perrier-Jouët. Those are big houses. And they make up, or they sell about 3/4 of the wine, of the champagne that we see in the world market. But they can't own more than 15% of the vineyards. So that's where the growers come in. And there are 20,000 different growers, probably growing from now. So these growers and these Grand Marques, they work together. And what happened was, there was a system of grading vineyards. You're probably familiar with the Grand Cru system. First growth, second growth, third growth, fourth growth, fifth growth in Bordeaux. And then Grand Cru, Premier Cru, non-rated in Burgundy. And we rate wineries in Bordeaux, if you will, Margaux and Lafite. And we rate vineyards in Burgundy, if you will, Montrachet, Le Musigny, and so on and so forth. In Champagne, we rate villages. So of the 357 villages, 42 are considered Premier Cru. You might be like, how did you remember 42? I'm like, 2 and 4, guys, duh. 2 and 2 is 4. I mean, but as many times as you can condense numbers, I'm telling you, it'll help you remember them. Okay, so 357 villages, 42 are Premier Cru, 17 are Grand Cru. And the thought is that if you're looking at Champagne, the best vineyards are going to be the ones that obviously face south, because we have a problem, or we had a problem ripening grapes. So the best vineyards should face and get the most sun. And if they do, then they're going to produce riper grapes. And if the grapes are riper, in theory, when we ferment, we're going to get more flavor, we're going to get more body, more texture, more intensity. So in that way, we would imagine that Grand Cru, it's the entire village that's rated. Some of my favorite include Ambonnet, Bouzy. So these are individual villages that are considered to be better or the best in the Champagne. And then Premier Cru follows. And then there are villages that are just not rated. So what really happened in the beginning was there was a CIVC. It's like a Comité Interprofessionnel de Vente de Champagne. The CIVC kind of represented the growers and the Grand Marques. And what they did is they used to set the price of the harvest. So they would say, you know, we're going to give you X amount of a percentage. This is the price. And if you have Grand Cru vineyards, you're going to get 100% of that price per kilo of grapes. And if you have Premier Cru, it's going to be somewhere between 90 and 99%. And so what they did was they set the price, and then they made sure that the growers and the producers got along, and so on. And now they no longer set the price. Now it's kind of like, well, you can set your own price. But at that time, you can imagine that the growers were used to getting paid by the amount of kilos of grapes that they brought in. So that might not motivate someone to like really tend to their vine. And the large champagne houses, of course, wanted good quality because their name was on it. So you can imagine that there's like this kind of disconnect, if you will. And actually, you still see it sometimes. Like, it's almost now, it's like really funny and like good sported. Like 2010 was so difficult because since it rained so much, all of a sudden, some grapes got mildew. So the grapes split and you got rain and the grapes swelled. And so you had this like rot, not noble rot, but rot, gray rot spreading. So people that picked early, they were saved. People that waited till the rain happened. We had to wait until the water dried out. But at the same time, the mold was spreading. So they had to be careful that when they picked their grapes, they were really selecting only healthy grapes. Otherwise, you get this like mushroomy mustiness. So you can imagine if you not own your own vineyards and you're at the mercy of these growers, most of which you have long-term relationships, it's very difficult in a vintage like 2010. So I went to visit Jean-Baptiste Lacaillon. He's the winemaker that I think is one of a really great chef du cave. And he was hosting us, and he had this long driveway leading up to Champagne Roederer, sorry, like tongue twister. And in the driveway, there were all these like guys with their FYBs, right? And their little baskets. And they were waiting to be received by Jean-Baptiste. And he was definitely taking their grapes, weighing them. I'll tell you about that after. And he was taking the top layer of the grapes off and looking. And like once in a while, he'd see some grower trying to like give him moldy grapes. So it's like, okay, like I'm not paying you per kilo of grapes that I have to then throw away. So in a vintage like that, it was really, really important that he was selecting and working with growers. So there are great growers. I mean, these guys, unbelievable. But then there are obviously people that just need to get paid. They're farmers, right? So fast forward, the opposite is true. There are growers like the guy I worked with that we were working these like little parcels of land. He farms most of his property like organic, if not biodynamic. So we have all these like, you know, different plants growing in between the vines, and the vines are so alive. There's snails, there's ladybugs, there's life in the vineyard. So you know, I knew, because he had little parcels in all these different villages. I knew when I was working or picking grapes for him. But then imagine if there were 2 rows next to his property that somebody else owned, like let's say a very big Grand Marque, maybe someone that doesn't necessarily have high quality standards. You could see automatically, like, not all, by the way. So, but this one row is like, there's no ladybugs, there's no snails. It's, you know, it's just like small little teeny grapes. And so I would ask him, like, are we in your vineyard or are we in like a different vineyard? And he'd make a joke, like he'd name a big house champagne, like the top cuvee, and he would be like, it's cuvee blah, blah, blah. So like, not to use names, but like, oh, what's that vineyard? Oh, cuvee Dom Perignon. And you're like, obviously he was joking about that, but it's crazy, right? So there's still that kind of like debate, which is better, like a big house that has money to buy the best grapes, to market the wines, or these small growers who tend to the vines. I think there's great and good. But anyway, that's the grower conversation. So now we need to talk about rosé. So rosé champagne versus what we're calling clear champagne or blanc champagne. So rosé champagne and rosé in general can be made a couple different ways. But in the case of Europe and the EU, the only way to make rosé as a still wine is to bleed some of the colors from a red grape. So for example, if I'm making Sancerre and I'm making a Pinot Noir based wine in Sancerre and I want to make it to rosé, the only way I could make that is to take Pinot Noir grapes and leave them on the skins and the juice together for a short period of time, and then I have Sancerre Rosé from Pinot Noir. I can't take Sauvignon Blanc and blend it with Pinot Noir and make Sancerre Rosé. So blending wines in the EU to make rosé is not permitted, except in champagne. So there are ways that you can make champagne, rosé champagne, by just blending a teeny bit of red wine into your white wine. And so we did that at La Herte Frère, which is the place where I worked harvest. So at La Herte, we would make a normal rosé, or an entry-level rosé, I should say, where we took a little teeny bit of our Chardonnay and we blended it with still red wine. It's called Coteaux Champenois. So we had some Pinot Noir we pressed and we made red wine, and then we just literally took a little bit of red and spiked the tank, and then we had our house rosé. This is not that. So this is a single parcel of vine, which is called Le Bourdier, and it's called Rosé de Sagné, and it's Rosé de Sagné Pinot Meunier. We're all speaking champagne now, right? I know you know these things now. So Rosé de Sagné, Sagné is technically like to bleed, and Pinot Meunier is the grape. So it's 100% Meunier. And what happened in this case is I got this like tap. I got like the wink at breakfast, and all of the harvest team was going to harvest like normal grapes, which was very, like I said, very difficult, because if you really cared about what you were doing, you have to cut out that kind of moldy stuff. So Thierry from the family, he said, it was the father, he said, I'm only gonna pick like a crew of 6 people, and we're all gonna go and harvest Le Bordier. And this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the most perfect cluster of Pinot Meunier. This is old vines, so the clusters are really, really tight and very, very small. And if there's any bit of imperfection, just like even the tiniest bit, we're not gonna include it in this. Then what we did is we took the perfect, beautiful clusters of Pinot Meunier and we brought them back into the press house right away. And we had this like really Mac Daddy lunch while everybody else was like finishing the normal work. No, I'm kidding. I was just like so happy, like, you chose me, really? He was like, yeah, you're an MS and you're working for free. You're very serious. The Brick Girls didn't even bring the right clothes. The Aussie, he's like still talking about how Tasmania wine is better. The Belgians are busy flipping, beds because they've been doing this for 15 years and they just think it's summer camp. He's like, yes, you're picked. I'm like, yes. And so we pick these perfect clusters of grapes and then we bring them into the press house. And there's a couple different presses in Champagne, but you can imagine you squeeze grapes and the cluster can fall somewhere. And if you soak the skins with the juice for however short or long period of time, you get the rosé color that you want. So it's kind of bleeding some of the color from the skins of these perfectly ripe clusters. And we actually had a very, very small tank of this. So I have this video where we show these clusters of Meunier going into this tank, and it's a very small amount. And then once you have the desired color and or flavor extraction, I think for this it was like, I don't know, a couple of hours. Then you have your base wine, and then you do all the stuff we talked about in the beginning. So this is a very special wine. It's not cheap. Because, like I said, it's a hand-selected, old vine, small parcel, very labor-intensive, but incredible. And some people are discouraged by these kind of colors, that they're like deep, deep rosé. I mean, to me, this is dinner wine. This is hanger steak. This is like full-on. If somebody tells you that you can't have a juicy burger and pair it like with champagne, don't invite him over for juicy burgers and champagne rosé de Sangnier again. I don't know anything about that. No, I'm kidding. But honestly, this is a wine that when you think about it, it's got the fruitiness of the Meunier grape, but it's got texture, and it's got tannin as a champagne, and that's why I would serve it in this kind of burgundy glass. So like, let the aromas come to your nose. You get the yeast, you get the brioche, you get that cranberry toasted bread, get flowers. Okay, but when you taste it, that's when you really enjoy it. So, sometimes I think of these wines like, if we closed our eyes and we didn't know it was bubbly, and we didn't know it was sparkling, or, rosé, would we even think it was a still red wine? Maybe. I mean, there's some burgundies that I've had that taste like this. They've got like the texture, the flavor. So we can do like the champagne rosé Sangnier challenge instead of like the soda challenge, right? We just like put some wine in solo cups and like, is this rosé de Sangnier or is this red wine? Who knows what we would come up with. I guess the point is, I have one other thing I want to tell you, and I hope I'm good on time. I really like this because I want to talk about like the Cocard press, because I realized like in a master class I didn't mention this yet. So there's this traditional press that they use in Champagne, and the press looks like a big, big, big barrel. It's actually really quite cool. It's the traditional one, so not everybody has them. Some people have them, some people don't. They've been replaced with much easier technology called pneumatic presses, but this traditional press, imagine like, it looks like a big barrel, and then it has essentially like clamps on the side and like a press that comes down. And so this Cocard press, holds 4,000 kilos of grapes. By the way, that's a lot of grapes. And it has the ability to so you bring in your grapes into your cocard and you measure them, and everything is strictly measured. And so I had this forklift that we would like take these little FYBs, and then they came into the winery, and the Maniec guy came and dropped it. And so we have this forklift, and we put it on a measuring kind of like, looks like one of those things that you measure whatever in, I don't know, whatever. I can't think of the word. Scale. Ha! Yes, I'm so glad I have an audience. So we have a scale, and we put these grapes on. We measure. We get 4,000 kilos. Okay, now we can start the press. So we clamp on these like little things on the sides, and the first time the press squeezes the grapes, it's going gravity fed into the tanks underneath the winery. So the press house is above. And that's where I hung out. Like, we worked all day in the afternoon. All of the other guys went to like hang out and party, and I went to the press house. So the press house, all like the winemakers and the full-time harvest team are up there. And the first press is 2,050 liters of wine. So by law, you're allowed to extract from 4,000 kilos of grapes 2,550. The first pressing is 2,050, and the second pressing is 500. So what usually happens is you use the second pressing. You could imagine the grapes and the wine is a little more harsh. You use the second pressing as kind of like a spice rack. So your first press is the vin de presse, and then the second press is the vin de taille, and that like tails, if you will, are used as like a kind of a filler, or to add tannin, or to add structure. So that's really important. It's like 4,000 kilos of grapes. By law, you can extract 2,550 liters of juice. And so those are, it's a delicate press, but the interesting thing is you can imagine compacting all this grape skin, and then what happens when you do the second press? You can't just like open the press and like squeeze it down again. So you get in there with like forklifts, and you just kind of like mash up all the grape skins and pits and stems. And then you can put the things back on and press it again. And then the two are separated and then blended together. There is a third pressing, which is called the rebêche. That's like the third time you use it. And most of that gets distilled into brandy. So those are the different pressings. And the pneumatic pressing is different, but those are the cocard, and that's a traditional way. And I think that's important. We drank, I think there were 40 harvest team members and 10 days official for harvest, and we drank like 500 bottles of champagne. That was really, really crazy. And the funniest part is like, there's this really knowledgeable wine professional that specializes in champagne. His name is Peter Liam, and he came every couple days to see me. He lived in DZ in Champagne, one of the premier crus, and he would like take me around to Champagne when I was working, visit other wineries. And he was like, "You're drinking Harvest Cuvée," which I don't mind, because the Harvest Cuvée was like the second pressing. Like, this poor family is not going to give us 400 bottles of champagne to drink. But, so then we went to other wineries and we tasted. But it was really funny because at the end of the harvest, there's this thing called coquelet, and I'll leave you with this. Coquelet is like the party to end the harvest, and it's insane. Like, I really love the idea that, we take ourselves and wine so seriously, but it's really just a bunch of farmers making good beverages that get us, happy in spirit and maybe a little tipsy. But these guys at the end of harvest, the vendage, right? The vendage is like 10 days worth of like, oh my God, what's gonna happen? Is my whole harvest gonna be ruined by this one rainstorm or frost? So you can imagine the anxiety of a grower, their a year's worth of work. And then when it's done, it's like, oh, exhale, get the harvest team out of here. But the night of the coquelet, they took like the flares from the cars when you get a flat tire and you put those flares. They're out the window. The Belgians they were really funny. They were like out the window having like these parties. Everyone's honking their horn. They've got like cars up on like cement blocks. Like, everyone's playing practical jokes on each other, flipping each other's beds, drinking champagne, and that was harvest, and it was beautiful. And I'll do it again. And that's my story. Cheers. Thanks for for coming. So fun. You guys are great. I'll pay you all the money I told you I would pay you for laughing on cue.